Dr. Sujata.
Good morning, everybody. This is Wednesday, September 6th. Welcome to the community-based forum of the World Council. And our subject today is about unconscious bias. And we have a subject matter expert with us. Not only is she an SME, but she is a global expert. So she's a GME, a global matter expert. And I do want to say a few things about her. Her name is Senela. And let me just pull this up so I can get this correct here. I want to be sure to introduce her properly and give her the credit due. Senela was awarded Exceptional Women of Excellence by the Women's Economic Forum, and she is the recipient of the Women Icons Asia Award. She is a certified transformation coach, innovation coach, and an expert in personal agility. She is the global CEO of Women Empowered Global and founder of 1 Million Women in Power. She's recognized among the top 150 global women leaders. She has trained teams from the World Bank, the United Nations, multinationals, and large conglomerates. She has been a keynote speaker for myriad of international events and conferences. She has spoken on professional development, the future of work, entrepreneurship, DEI, career advancement, and innovation. She is also a judge, a mentor, and an incubator, leader of incubator programs. She is among the 13 trailblazing women from 13 countries around this world. And she's been featured in a book, Women Going Global, that was released during Global Entrepreneurship Week USA. Mamma mia! As if that wasn't enough, she's got a slew of awards and recognitions: Global Women Leadership Award, Global Women for Change, G100 Country Chair for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, magazines from Australia, Excellence Awards from Singapore, and the iconic Women Creating a Better World for All. It is my distinct privilege to know Senela, to work with Senela, and to improve this world for women. So our topic today is unconscious bias, and I'm so excited to hear what she has to say. So without any further ado, Senela, the stage is yours.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sujata. You have been such a wonderful force, even being a female leader on our panel for 1 Million Women in Power. And I'm absolutely honored to be here on your invitation. Thank you so much once again. So hi, everybody. It's so great to be with you. And I am so connected to today's topic. When Dr. Sujata invited me, I said, oh my goodness, sign me up, because we are going to talk about how to overcome unconscious bias. I want to give you a little bit of context, a little bit about me that you probably don't know. So I was born to a part of the world where our little baby girls are raised to get married, and our baby boys are raised to start a business. So that's to give you a little bit of context. And when it came to the age where I was about 20, past 20 years, my father, he said, the only way that you are going to leave this house is through marriage. So it's really interesting when you think about conscious bias, unconscious bias, you think about the things that are associated with that. When I think about unconscious bias, I think about dogmas, childhood trauma, self-perception, triggers, conscious, unconscious. I'm also thinking about, just recently, the other day, I was speaking to a DEI leader who's responsible for Nordics region, and we were talking about a women's career advancement program, a training coaching program, and he said something really interesting. He said, Senela, when it comes to women, I'm just specifically taking women in this particular as an example. When it comes to women, they're really good with compliance. But when it comes to managing risk, there is a little bit of aversion. But they're really great at excelling in executing a specific task. Why? It's linked to perfectionism. Why? It's linked to the compliance mindset. And I gave you the example, even how I was raised in that environment. So when you think about unconscious bias, it goes back many, many years ago to the conditions, the limiting beliefs, the social conditioning, the norming, the stereotyping, what we have been exposed to. So when we think about unconscious bias, I want you to think about it in that full breadth and context. So let's look at the definition of unconscious bias. When you think about unconscious bias is really about an attitude that affects the way an individual thinks and feels and responds to someone around them or something. Unconscious bias influences our everyday thought, our interactions, and actions. So it's a really big thing, isn't it? When you think about unconscious bias, it's really the premise of how we decide and choose things. It's really the premise of what influences our behavior at a very unconscious level. And I remember this data that said in a study that approximately 80% of our behavior is influenced by our subconscious thinking. So I want you to factor that in again when we think about unconscious bias. So what I'd like to do is for us to just think from a very thought-provoking sense, when we think about what are these things that really influence our interactions, our actions, our behavior, why is unconscious bias and how is unconscious bias really even impacting us on an everyday basis? For us to understand how to overcome something, I think the first breath of air we need to take is, do we even have an understanding of what this even means? Why is this so significant? Why is this so widespread and prevalent? And why should I be interested to know about it and take interest to see what I can do to make it better? I'll tell you why. Here are some thought-provoking facts for you about unconscious bias. Number one, unconscious bias is a universal phenomenon. And what I mean by that is that it's not limited to a particular race. It's not limited to a particular gender or culture. It's a universal human experience. It's happening to you and it's happening to me. It's a universal phenomenon. That's the first one. Another fact about unconscious bias, it's quick and automatic. Unconscious bias, it could operate in a very rapidly and automatic manner. You might not even consciously think about it, but it will sort of get you into making a snap judgment about something. And this can impact decision-making and choices. So it's very quick, it's automatic almost. And I think that is where also the concern that leadership today across organizations are having is, how do we mitigate, how do we manage, how can we eradicate this phenomena called unconscious bias from taking over our workplace, from taking over our hiring and recruitment practices, from taking over our job promotions, from taking over how we assign duties. how do we manage this? Because it's a risk for business, and it's a risk to progression, advancement, and impact and outcome. So I'm going to give you number 3. Some experts say that unconscious bias is perhaps a survival mechanism. It's something that where we quickly assess someone, whether that person is a friend or a foe, based on unconscious bias. So some people say perhaps it's a survival mechanism. Another one, I remember a friend in Canada was telling me she's Asian, she's South Asian, and she migrated to Canada and she had some health issues, and she went to the healthcare system, and the diagnosis and her treatment was impacted based on her race. And she was sharing this experience with me. And of course, it's a very personal experience. And I was thinking, wow, so this is the level of impact and significance that unconscious bias can have even on treating an individual. Because it's based on appearance, it's based on something, it's on the base of something. So that is really the division that unconscious bias can bring to something, which is it's very serious. Another one, when you think about the education system, unconscious bias exists even there. If I think about even my own daughter's school, she comes home and tells me, Mom, today my teacher said, oh, Sarella, you're like this. And, I'm sure, you're very, you come across as a very, bubbly character, but if only you can apply that to your studies, you're not very good in this particular subject. Now, the teacher's assumption is influencing her language, and that's reinforcing certain negative biases and beliefs that my daughter is being fed. And then she walks out there as a young leader, a young woman, and she's going to carry these dogmas around her life as well. So the education system is also having unconscious bias existing. Another one I want us to think about when we think about unconscious bias is media representation. Media and entertainment can reinforce certain stereotypes and biases when it comes to certain cultural groups, when it comes to certain segments. I want you to think about media representation as well when we talk about unconscious bias. What is media and entertainment really promoting? How do we break away from the typical stereotypical portrayal of groups, cultural references? That's another conversation around unconscious bias. And also, I will finally say confirmation bias. Confirmation bias. What is confirmation bias? That is on unconscious bias, where we seek out information that only supports an existing belief we had about someone or something. So end of the day, rather than being very objective towards something, because of unconscious bias, we are influenced to think in a rather subjective manner. And as you know, when you take that kind of ideology and you translate that into a workplace scenario, you're definitely going to have a situation where people are going to feel oppressed. You're going to have a situation where people around you are not going to feel psychologically safe. They're not going to feel included. They're not going to feel belonged, right? Because there's a lot of bias that's triggered in that scenario. Now, 2 more very important thought-provoking points I want to talk to you about, and then we are going to move into how then can we overcome. So my last 2 thought-provoking facts around unconscious bias is this. The difficulty when it comes to self-recognition. We're very quick to judge the bias that someone else is imposing on us or something, but what about taking an introspective look into ourselves? What about the biases that we hold in ourselves? What about how we perceive the world? What is our worldview on someone, something? I want you to think about that. And this doesn't come naturally to us. Have we done a stock count of how biased we are about certain things, certain topics, certain, the way people look, the way they talk, a name, an appearance? I want us to think about self-recognition. We find it challenging to recognize our own unconscious biases because unconscious bias, the very fabric of unconscious bias, is operated beneath our conscious awareness. This is where it gets really tricky. So that is why I think it's so important to think about how we can use mindfulness, how we can have education around this, have conversations around this, and I'm excited to move into steps on how we can overcome. Just one more thing before that I want to tell you, before we move into that, is that the good news is that thanks to neuroplasticity, unconscious bias, right, we do have the ability to change, we do have the ability to adapt. So thank goodness we have neuroplasticity, so our brains can be rewired. It's not too late to reprogram.
Thank you so much, Senela. I just wanted to read one of the comments that we have in the chat. So Luciana says, power relations create channel view bias. Take the health providers, like teachers, since they were mentioned, have their patterns in assessing patients. So as people are going back to school, you know, what can you say to those teachers, those professors, in, you know, perhaps the next portion for rectifying bias? Like, what can these teachers do? What can professors do to minimize their bias? Because you said, you know, bias causes exclusion. It's very difficult for people to feel like they belong once that bias comes in. And I love the point that you made, that bias affects the words that we use. It affects the language, our sentences, what we are saying to students. So, you know, most of us here are educators, so please expound on how we can be more aware. And like Luciana said, you know, how do we get out of this pattern? So thank you.
Absolutely, I love that question. I'm actually going to address it in the next section when I talk about some very practical and meaningful strategies and solutions and recommendations that we can discuss further and explore together and see how we can implement and practice that at an individual level. And, you know, from a systemic perspective, if I try to answer your question from a systemic perspective, there has to be policy regulation about this. You know, there has to be policy regulation around how teachers really create those safe spaces for students to talk about challenges, to talk about the hardships and struggles they might have at an individual level when it comes to absorbing the content, when it comes to following through with the class. So what happens is a teacher, an educator, tends to have a more generalist view when it comes to classroom discipline, when it comes to education, and not so much the individualistic view. So when you think about really negating bias, it's about negating the idea that everybody is the same. Because at the end of the day, we are, you know, very different. Not one child is the same. So that is really reprogramming the belief system of the educator to educate them and tell them there is another way, there is a better way. And usually, if we can create those scenarios of teaching them that there is a better way, these are some of the ways you can approach how you conduct certain situations, most often than not, when they know that there's a better way. And if there's some sensitization done, and systemically, if there's management coming down and saying, hey, you know what, we need to make sure that you implement a very unbiased way of conducting these situations. And these are some recommendations how we as a school, we as a management would like you to practice. When you show the way and you give them some sort of regulation to say this is something we want to regulate as a school, as an education institute, more often than not, you would see the change beginning. It starts with that. The leadership needs to be clear on the direction. We cannot expect one teacher in isolation to make that change. That's not the way we can really approach the situation. It has to happen at every level. So they have to have a clear systemic policy towards unconscious bias. What is their policy when it comes to handling student grievance? What is their policy when it comes to that individualistic approach to make sure that the students are really looked after? So I'm going to also be going through more ideas with you and would love to hear your thoughts as well. And then we can share our ideas together. Thank you for that wonderful question. I also do want to give you one more comment around a thought-provoking fact when we talk about unconscious bias before I move on to the solutions is this. I want us to also think about the dimension of intersectionality when we talk about unconscious bias. What do we mean by that? Unconscious bias tends to be compounded for individuals who belong and represent multiple marginalized groups, emphasizing the importance to address this. For example, if you take somebody like me, South Asian, and assuming I've totally migrated to a completely different foreign land, and I have to cross border, learn the culture, learn this, learn that, study everything, and at the same time, I have my own biases that I'm facing, and totally sort of trying to reintegrate to a completely new market from a business standpoint, trying to reintegrate to a new society from a social impact. These are multiple factors. So this is where intersectionality comes into play as well when we think about unconscious bias and addressing that. Now, the exciting news. Let's talk about how we can then together overcome unconscious bias. I want you to take a minute and pause here and think and reflect based on what I've said and based on also my call to action to each of us in the room today when it comes to us having that self-recognition. Are we biased as individuals? It's one thing to advocate for it, but are we still having unconscious bias as individuals? What do we need to do to overcome that? I want you to think about that. If we're having any bias towards somebody's age, how they look, their appearance, their name, their culture, the kind of music they listen to, we're constantly making deductions on someone and something. What then can we do as change agents to be different, to be a role model, to advocate, to begin that ripple effect change? What can we do? So here are some thoughts from me. I think the first step for any transformation at any scale is awareness. And of course, self-awareness. The first step towards unconscious bias is awareness. So if we look at it from an individual lens, what am I doing currently? Do an audit on yourself. Have others, people close to you, your peers, give you feedback and be vulnerable enough to ask that feedback. Let us be humble enough to ask that feedback. I used to be somebody who's very judgmental growing up because I had a lot of judgmental people around me. That was my environment. That was the language that I knew. And then I had to consciously unpack all of those layers and almost be reborn, almost had to relearn new social skills. How cognizant I am about this, when I approach things and situations and people, I'm more sensitized to people and things. I'm more inclusive, and that was a conscious effort, but it all began with having self-awareness, taking that self-audit, becoming aware of one's own biases, limiting beliefs, and that's going to initiate meaningful change. Number two, once you have this self-awareness, let's move to self-reflection. What do we want to do about this? How do we do more self-reflection on this? How do we take time to work on ourselves and reprogram some of these beliefs? Now, the interesting thing about reprogramming beliefs, and I'm sure Dr. Sujata will have a huge amount of information to share on this because she's done such amazing work on our platform, 1 Million Women in Power, and she speaks very deeply into this conversation. How can you be cognizant and do it in a very mindful manner, make this transition? When you think about self-reflection, you need to ask yourself questions, challenging questions like, where do these biases come from? where are my biases even coming from? How have these biases influenced my decisions and actions? What are these biases? Where are they coming from? How have they influenced the person I am today? How are they going to influence the kind of person I want to be? Ask yourself these self-reflective questions. These are powerful questions. And nobody else can answer these for you. Only you can answer these questions. And be honest as you answer, be honest to yourself. The next one is empathy, taking a route of empathy and perspective taking. So empathy is a very powerful tool. We talk a lot about empathy because empathy is really about removing your shoes and then getting into somebody else's. Usually, when we talk about empathy, it's the idea of, oh, yeah, thinking from someone else's perspective and wearing their shoes. The issue is we're still wearing our own shoes and we try to fit into someone else's. Guess what? It doesn't fit. You need to literally take off your shoes, take off your existing mindset, and then get into someone else's shoes and try to get into their mindset and understand how it feels in their experience. That is what true empathy really means. So having that, taking, perspective taking and practicing empathy in this scenario is really going to help us look at things from a different vantage point, from a different lens. Another one is really exposure. It's education, it's exposure. Gosh, the more I traveled, a lot of my work is global. So I tend to meet people from over 40, 50 different countries around the world on a very regular basis. And it sort of forced me to come out of my comfort zone. But coming out of my comfort zone was not very natural to me. But through exposure, now it's become my norm. It's become natural to me. So I think exposure, seek out that exposure, stretch your hand out for assignments where you get to interact with other people, try to, plug into communities, associations, and societies where it challenges you to be seated next to people who look different to you, who talk different to you, who speak in a different language. That's, we have this whole thing about, we got to collaborate with like-minded people, but then where is the real advantage of learning? Where is the cross-fertilization of ideas if it's all about having a room of people who look like us and talk like us? Let us challenge ourselves to get connected to people and experiences that are going to pull us out of our skin. So that's what I mean by exposure. And that's really going to challenge you to confront your unconscious bias, because you know why? Like it happened to me, your unconscious bias is going to start surfacing. People are going to start noticing it. You're going to start noticing it. And you're going to be like, hey, I went for the networking event and Sarah said this. I'm taking Sarah as an example. Sarah said this to me, and this is how I reacted. What happened? Why was I so triggered by what Sarah said? Okay, that's what I mean. So take into stock what happened, do that audit, be very conscious about this. And it's going to take effort because you're literally going to unpack everything that you thought was you, that you thought was the way, because generationally, perhaps it was the way that had been your exposure. But the more exposure that you pick up along the way, it's going to shape you, reshape you into the person that you want to be, that you consciously, deliberately choose to be on a very intentional basis. And another one I would say would be to really challenge stereotypes. We talk about challenging status quo, also challenge stereotypes. I think stereotyping is something that sort of reinforces the bias we have towards people, a person, a situation, a place. All of this gets reinforced the minute we start confining ourselves into social norms, social conditioning, stereotypical roles, that sort of thing. So I would say be very wary about stereotyping. That's something we need to think about. We need to look at ways how we can start debunking stereotypes. I mean, I've already started doing this even, with, my own daughter would come to me and say, hey, mom, the other day I was at grandma's place and grandma and grandpa weren't very happy with how I sat. They said, sit like a girl. That's not how girls sit, mom. How should I sit? And I said, darling, you sit how you want, darling. Then she said, well, mom, is there a way that boys sit? What is this social conditioning around how a girl ought to sit versus how a boy ought to sit? I'm talking about a 12-year-old. She goes to a grandparent's house and there's a bias around how she has to sit, right? So I want us to think about very practical things like that. What are we exposing our children to? That's very important. And another very interesting thing I want to tell you that you can implement it at a very practical level as educators in the room as well is something called bias interruptions. You disrupt the way that a process is happening that reinforces any bias. You disrupt that process, and that's called bias interruption. I'll give you an example. A simple example would be the hiring process. You disrupt the hiring process by using blind resumes to eliminate the influence of names, gender, or other identification factors. You sort of annul those biases by, with blind resumes. So that sort of, we need to be a little bit more innovative, be open to curiosity to see how else we can do things. Have a brainstorming session with your group, with your team, when you go back after this talk and think, hey, what are some bias interrupters we can have in our organization, in our team? What are the processes right now that we need to do an audit on to see that are really reinforcing biases? What are some new creative ways, new practices that we can adopt, when it comes to, leaving out those biases? So number one, doing the audit and identifying and pinpointing those processes in your organization and team and practices that are creating biases and reinforcing biases, and then going back and having a brainstorming session to see how you can actually practically, as a team, unique to that culture, think of more inclusive ways to really harness belongingness and DEI in your team. And finally, I would say inclusive leadership. When you think about inclusive leadership, you think about feedback. You think about taking accountability, not just for your team, but also for yourself. Hold yourself accountable above all. Go above and beyond to stand for, practices that will really encourage people to check themselves, to check the language they use, to be more mindful, to be more conscious about how they interact with people, hold each other accountable, and approach this situation, with the stick and as well as a carrot. And what I mean by that is, there's this beautiful quote by a lady I came across on the internet, really, a lady called McCree, and she says, your heart is a powerful force, so use it consciously. And I want to sum that up to say, to overcome unconscious bias, start celebrating conscious living. That's really what it is, isn't it? At the end of the day, because unconscious bias happens at a very unconscious awareness level, what if we can be more conscious about living, conscious about our intentions, conscious about the words we use, conscious about our body language. I do so much of coaching and training around this on executive human being. Are we actively listening to hear someone, or are we listening for information, or are we listening to understand? There's a distinction, right? So being mindful, being conscious living, serve with your heart. And unconscious bias is, basically, if you want to negate that, there is no room for ego. You cannot overcome unconscious bias and maintain ego. We need to be ready to challenge ourselves and think outside the box. And with that, I pass the talking stick back to Dr. Sujatha, and would love to hear your thoughts as well and continue this conversation. Back to you.
Thank you so much, Senela. So many pearls of wisdom in what you said. I want to go to the chat. Luciana, she said the UNESCO prompted, let's see, her first thing was unconscious bias stories could be a good prompt for UNESCO's model of story circles, where we tell and listen to stories in order to understand people, verifying assumptions, keeping an agile mindset. So then Amparo said, Yes, looking at the UNESCO prompted story circles for exchange and partage stories and cultural exchange cultures of others. I think that your point of how we're listening to other people's stories, and I want to make sure that this group is fully understanding what you're saying. So when we are listening to other people's stories, we are taking in, we are processing. So what Senela is saying is, as we're listening to those stories from the story circles, we have to bias interrupt. So our internal process, whatever's going on, that we're thinking, perceiving, judging as the brain does, Senela's asking us to interrupt that bias thinking, that kind of thinking. You see? So this is like an internal thing that we really need to be aware of, first thing. Second thing Senela said was we had to reflect on it. But the immediate thing we need to do is, at that moment when we feel ourselves making assumptions, we need to interrupt. We need to interrupt that kind of thinking right then and there.
Absolutely, I love that. And I also like the comment by Luciana. She had said about a lady, an elderly lady who had run 20 kilometers, and that's a model of self-changing affirmation commitment. I think that's really profound, and that's what it's about, those stories, and it's really bringing us challenging how we perceive things. And I love how you summed it up, Dr. Sujata. Absolutely. And when you really think about it, this is so actionable. This is not rocket science. I can do it. You can do it. We're already kind of sort of doing it, but we can definitely do it better. And the more of us who do it together, we keep talking, we have these kinds of dialogues, and you start seeing more and more circles taking place. And I love the idea about the story sharing as well. Love it.
Thank you, Senela. And I think that why this piece is so difficult, and it's more difficult than rocket science, because we can build a rocket that's external, and we can see the nuts and the bolts. We have the wrench to help us to put those nuts and bolts together. But the internal work, a person will rarely admit that they are a nut, because from their perspective, they are 100% correct. And that's why that self-awareness, that self-reflection is such an important piece. Didam, you have your hand up, my friend.
Yes, Sujata, so good to see you and so good to see everyone. And Senela, thank you very much. It was such a wonderful speech. And, unconscious bias is one of the topics that I'm really passionate about. So thank you so much. Your insights were super helpful. So I just wanted to, since you were talking about like active listening and story circles and all other things, I also wanted to remind you that sometimes, according to research, short amount of interactions might cause confirmation bias, as Senela mentioned, because you don't have enough time to get to know the other person, or you don't have enough time to feel empathy, and you don't have maybe time to question your bias, right? Because you have only a few hours to talk to the other person, and then after that you may not totally get rid of your bias or question your bias. So I feel like to be able to just start questioning, feeling empathy, and to start understanding the other people, I think long-term interaction, at least, maybe a few times interaction is necessary. And that's also that's why maybe schools are so important, because students see each other all the time on a regular basis, right? Some projects might be really, helpful to, question those biases, etc. But at the end of the day, I know that this is super important, because our everyday decision, everyday behavior is affected by our bias, and everyone has bias, right? So that is super important. The most important thing is how can we continue this conversation at schools, at work, other places, so that people will stop saying, I don't have any bias. Right? So that is super important. But thank you again, Senela. I appreciate your speech. Thank you.
I love your share, and that is so true. Absolutely. It's so interesting. That reminds me of one of my friends who's an NLP specialist, happened to mention, and he's in the States, he practices in the States. He mentioned, Dr. Sujata, that end of the day, as adults, they say it's easy to influence a child, it's harder to fix a grown adult, right? But, speaking of that, when it comes to really making that change, end of the day, we're all going to have dogmas. We're all going to have these childhood traumas triggering us every day. But I really appreciate what he said. He said that end of the day comes down to our response. Yes, we have these biases, but if we act on them and we respond and it hurts someone or it makes somebody feel excluded, that is problematic. So it's one thing to feel, it's one thing to feel something. And I love what you said about the short interactions, because in that moment, I had to learn this. I had to learn so much of this myself. I now consciously catch myself telling myself at networking events, Senela, don't judge, don't react. So I love your share. Thank you.
Thank you.
Are there any other questions or comments, please, for Senela? Don't be shy now. We're all women here, right? Women empowered. So I do have, I want to bring back the point of intersectionality. Can you just talk for a couple of minutes on those multiple factors? You said that when we have intersectionality, multiple marginalized groups that are collecting together in a classroom, for example, it's people are in college classrooms. So what are those multiple factors that we should be aware of? And just expand on that, please. Yeah.
One of the things is, so it's a very interesting question. When you think about intersectionality, it really brings way more nuance to the conversation. And if we really want to nip something from the bud, we really need to put a micro lens into this. And there's never, when people ask me on any panel I speak around the world, they're like, Senela, what's the magic formula to empower people? And I always tell them there's no one formula. You really need to isolate A from B and really, go into that specific. What are the specificities that surround the problem, that surround the situation? So when you think about intersectionality and when it comes to unconscious bias, I'll give you a very interesting example. So my cousin, so I'm South Asian, I'm Sri Lankan, right? I was born in Sri Lanka, and now a lot of my work is global, so I'm everywhere. So now I'm global, right? But my cousin, her mom's Sri Lankan, her dad's Indian. She was born in Canada, and she's married to a Brit, and she's living in UK. She has a citizenship, and she has an apartment in London. Now that is a case study for intersectionality. If there is any other example, I mean, this is the one I got to tell you. So when you think about unconscious bias, she experiences different types of biases. She experiences biases from people as it relates to her being a brown-skinned Canadian, right? She experiences biases as it, she's a professor at university in UK, so she has a lot of promotional issues. She doesn't get promotion because her male counterpart gets the promotion before her because she's a woman. So there's a gender bias. So can you see the multifaceted issue? It's one person, but her experience around unconscious bias is stifling her in multiple ways and dimensions. That is what I mean about intersectionality. We are not just addressing the woman, we are addressing the fact that she's a Sri Lankan from immigrant parents, born and raised in Canada, now moved to London, citizen in London, working in a university. So that is really the idea. So when we really think about tackling intersectionality, unconscious bias, going to the depths, the roots of it, understand the nuance. And if each of us in the room today want to continuously level up on our knowledge, our exposure, we really need to do more studies and get more insights and fact gathering into intersectionality as it relates to unconscious bias. I hope that answers your question.
Beautiful, beautiful, Senela. And, let's, honestly, we would love to have you for a part 2 in the springtime. So I hope that, your schedule will allow, because like you said, you're just traveling all over this world. And honestly, it's such an honor and privilege to have a global expert just as yourself, to come and speak to us, because as educators, teachers, professors enter their classrooms, there is so much intersectionality in that classroom of 30 students, and especially those intro to something classes, which have 100 to 200 students in there. And your reminder to us that each is an individual, and there is no one-size-fits-all systemic program or a group program, but rather, it's with awareness, self-reflection, and creating larger, like-minded people coming together with that mindset and with, with that viewpoint to help this world. Amparo, I see that your hand is up. Do you have a question, please?
No, I just the by the say Senela, the particular story, the individual story of the people is very important for the individual, and the steps the form the steps contribute the former the personality, the skills, the competence important for the life, the people and the community. The story is very important for the community, and I appreciate the partage de Senela by the group. It's very interesting, and I said I look the woman, the hot woman, because in this moment the group I have the woman, but the woman who lives, one life is important.
Yes, thank you, Amparo. So Senela, the point that Amparo is making is how can we help the community in which we work or live? What steps can we take going forward? What steps can we take is what, she's saying. So.
I love that question. Thank you so much, Amparo, for that beautiful question. I mean, one of the things that I'm aware of that some of the companies are doing, particularly as it relates to intercultural issues that large organizations are having, because they, due to globalization, they have people they are recruiting from across the world. So then you have the cultural bias that comes into play. I'm just taking cultural bias as an example. So one of the interventions that I see LND and I leaders doing is that they form these sort of connects. They call it the expat circle. So that's a combination of the newcomers who have come from different countries. So they refer to them as expats, and say they have the employees who are in the resident country participate in that forum. So it's a forum really created by the organization, like a little pocket meeting sort of thing, where everybody gets to celebrate their individuality. Everybody is given the opportunity to express. Their voice is treated as equal. They feel safe. They feel belong because they're heard. Most of the times, whether it's at a community level, whether it's at an individual level, whether it's at a family level in the house, the discrepancy, the conflict happens when we don't feel heard, when we feel like we have something to say, but our voice is suppressed, right? So the minute you can adopt those very basic humanized approaches to problem solving, to making people feel included, even at a workplace scenario, you're bridging a gap already. So creating those little trust groups, those trust circles in the organization, I think that's going to go a long way for sure. So going back to your team, I think one call to action would be, for those of you who have attended today, as soon as you go back, try to identify who are the people from a cross-section of teams that you'd like to create a catalyst for change sort of a group with, and you start implementing these trust circles, right, across different regions depending on the coverage of your organization, and you give them a little bit of a modus operandi. You tell them this is a kind of, this is the vision that, and these are the values, the vision and the values that have to drive these meetings forward. We're not talking about business, we're talking about feelings, we're talking about their perspective. We're talking about facilitating their voice being heard. That's the vision.
Right.
That is where you're going to really reinforce that individuality coming out. And on concept, this sounds great, but I think the challenge would be that some organizations like to practice these things, but their implementation has gaps, because the leadership is not buying into the initiative, and somewhere down the line, this initiative goes wayside. So I think consistency is important, accountability is important, transparency, passion is important. So those are some factors I think that's going to really make this something truly transformational for the organization culture, because it's definitely a culture-driven mission. And the minute the organization culture is performing, guess what? It becomes a business-driven mission. A good culture is a healthy organization.
Yes. Perfect. What a wonderful point to close on. And, this community group that we have at the World Forum, we're concerned about empathy. We're concerned about meeting people's needs, all cultures having those needs. But there's 2 points here that are very important. One is the community building, the sense of community, belongingness that's internal, but also taking these ideas, these constructs, and these solutions to many communities, external communities, because we know what we're writing about, right? I mean, we get together, we support each other, and internally in our community of interculturalism, we know exactly what we're talking about, right? But we have to take this outside into different communities, into the business world, into the health sectors, so that they understand what we're saying. So that's why, that's my mission and vision. Has been for 2023, will be for 2024 too. So it's 1 o'clock. I'm going to stop recording now. Thank you so